This internal capsule is defined as a large number of fibers which project from the cerebral cortex to the interconnect with the subcortical centers in the brain and spinal cord and with the thalamus. This compact bundle of fibers is collectively known as internal capsule. Here in this diagram, you can see how the fibers from the cerebral cortex they come down and they pass between the thalamus and the caudate nucleus medially and lentiform nucleus laterally here. In horizontal section you can see this is the internal capsule. This is here which you can see is the internal capsule which lies which is V-shaped and the concavity of which opens laterally, and in this concavity lies laterally the lentiform nucleus, and medially here you can see anteriorly the caudate nucleus and posteriorly the thalamus. This internal capsule is situated in between the uh, it is situated in the inferior middle part of each cerebral hemisphere. In a horizontal section of the brain, it appears V-shaped with its concavity directed laterally. This concavity is occupied by lentiform nucleus. It contains large number of fibers going to and coming from the cerebral cortex. When traced upwards, the fibers of the capsule are continuous with the corona radiata. When these fibers are traced downwards, they converge and many of them are continuous with the crus cerebri of the midbrain. Here in this diagram, you can see the diverging fibers which are coming from the cerebral cortex here. And here in the internal capsule, you can see they compact down. All these fibers coming from a larger area of the cerebral cortex going to and fro, they compact in a small area here in the region of the internal capsule. And this internal capsule you can very well appreciate here. It is in horizontal section, you can see it is V-shaped here. The concavity of which opens here laterally, and in this concavity here you can see lying the lentiform nucleus. Medially, it is bounded with the caudate nucleus, head of the caudate nucleus anteriorly and thalamus posteriorly. Here you can, in this diagram, you can very well appreciate how these fibers from the cerebral cortex they converge in the region of the internal capsule, and this compact bundle inferiorly can be traced here in the crus cerebri of the midbrain. From the midbrain, it passes to the pons, and from the pons to the medulla. And here in the lower part of the medulla, you can see these fibers. They are crossing to the opposite side, meaning by the control of the cerebral cortex is contralateral side. And then after crossing, they pass in the spinal cord here. And here in the white matter of the spinal cord, you can see these fibers, they are forming the lateral corticospinal tracts. Here you can see the various parts of the internal capsule. The internal capsule is said to have an anterior limb lying between the head of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. A posterior limb here lying between the lentiform nucleus laterally and thalamus medially, and the bend between the anterior limb and the posterior limb is the genu, a retrolentiform part. Here, a retrolentiform part which goes posteriorly to the optic area of the occipital cortex, present in the occipital cortex, and a sublentiform part lying below the lentiform nucleus. So, sublentiform part which contains the auditory radiations, that is the mm, fibers concerned with the auditory sensation lying below the lentiform nucleus, and the optic radiation, that is the fibers of the visual pathway, lying behind the lentiform nucleus. So thus, the anterior limb lies between the head of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. The genu is the bend between the anterior limb and the posterior limb, and posterior limb lies between the thalamus and lentiform nucleus. The sublentiform part lies below the lentiform nucleus. It can be seen in the coronal section, whereas the rest of the parts are seen in the horizontal section only. The retrolentiform part lies below the lentiform nucleus. Relations of the internal capsule are: medially, it is related with the caudate nucleus and thalamus, and laterally, it is related with the lentiform nucleus. So, laterally lentiform. That way you can remember it. Here in this diagram, you can very well see the various tracts, various fibers which are present in the in the internal capsule. Here in the anterior limb, you can see the frontopontine and corticofugal fibers. Here you can see the corticopontine and the other corticofugal fibers. In the genu, you can see the corticonuclear fibers, and in the posterior limb here, you can see the corticopontine and other corticofugal fibers. Then you can see the corticospinal tract and the anterior thalamic radiations. Here you can see the lateral geniculate body, which is concerned here. The lateral geniculate body you can see, and here you can see the medial geniculate. So to summarize, you can see the corticopontine fibers lie in the anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb. The frontopontine fibers, they start from the frontal cortex to reach the pontine nuclei in the pons, and here these fibers they are relayed to reach the opposite cerebral hemisphere. These fibers they form the part of the corticopontonuclear pathway, and that way the information to the cerebellum from the cerebral cortex goes on the contralateral side. So the control is contralateral. The paritopontine and occipitopontine fibers they lie in the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule, while temporopontine fibers they lie in the sublentiform of the internal capsule. Now, the pyramidal fibers, that is the descending fibers, they comprise of corticonuclear fibers and corticospinal fibers. These pyramidal fibers they are called so because they are present in the pyramidal eminence in the upper part of the medulla oblongata. The corticonuclear fibers they start from the cerebral cortex and go to the nuclei of the oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducent, facial, hypoglossal, and nucleus ambiguous for the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory nerves of the opposite side. So these fibers, the corticonuclear fibers, they also cross to the opposite side. So that way the motor control is contralateral side. The corticospinal fibers for anterior horn cells of the spinal cord for head and neck lie in G. So corticospinal fibers they start from the cerebral cortex and they pass to the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. These fibers, which are destined for the head and neck region, they lie in the G. The fibers for the upper limb, trunk, and the lower limb lie in the posterior limb of the internal canal. And always remember that control of the cerebral cortex is always to the contralateral side. That if there is a lesion on the right side, then the paralysis will be on the left side and vice versa. Here, you can very well appreciate how these corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers they start from the cerebral cortex, they come here in the internal capsule, lying in the anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb. They are coming down in the crus cerebri of the midbrain. Then here they pass to the pons, and here the corticopontine fibers you can see appreciate that they are relayed here in the pontine nuclei and they pass to the cerebellum in the opposite side, cerebellum on the opposite side through the middle cerebral peduncle. Lower down, if you trace these fibers, here they lie in the bulge. They form a bulge here in the upper part of the medulla oblongata, and this bulge is known as pyramid. In the lower part of the medulla oblongata, you can see these fibers that cross to the opposite side, and then they come here and terminate in the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, and from here they form the in the spinal cord they form the lateral corticospinal tract. We will discuss the in detail the re- whole relations in the when we will see the structure of the spinal cord and medulla oblongata. Extrapyramidal fibers. So these are the motor fibers which lie outside the pyramid, and these fibers they start from the cerebral cortex as corticostriate fibers and corticorubral fibers. The corticostriate fibers they pass to the corpus striatum of the basal ganglion, and the corticorubral fibers they go to the red nucleus. They go to the red nucleus of the midbrain. Here you can see in this diagram the sensory fibers. The all the fibers which carry the sensations from the whole of the body, they ultimately terminate in the thalamus. Thalamus is the highest integrating center for the in the sensory pathway, and from here these third order neurons they start and they go to the various parts of the cerebral cortex depending upon to which sensations they belong. And as such, you can see the antiophthalmic radiations which go to the cingulate gyrus and the prefrontal area of the frontal. The superior thalamic radiations they go to the parietal lobe in the motor and the premotor areas, and they carry the general sensations. The posterior thalamic radiations they are mainly in the visual pathway. They are going posteriorly to the occipital lobe here. You can see they are going to the occipital lobe. The inferior thalamic radiations. Yeah, these inferior thalamic radiations they go inferiorly to the temporal lobe, and these are the fibers which are concerned with the auditory pathway. So, to summarize, the anterior, the sensory fibers, they are known as thalamocortical because the thalamus is the highest center for the integration of the sensory information, and these sensory fibers they are known that way they are known as thalamocortical. They can be classified into four groups. The anterior thalamic radiations, here the fibers starting anteriorly and dorsomedial nuclei of the thalamus, they terminate in the frontal. The superior thalamic radiation, these fibers they start in the ventral group of the thalamic nuclei and reach the sensory areas of the frontal and the parietal lobe. The inferior thalamic radiation, you can see, they connect the medial geniculate body with the primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, and they form the auditory radiation. So these fibers of the inferior thalamic radiations, they are also known as auditory radiations because these are the fibers concerned with the uh, auditory pathway. The posterior thalamic radiations, these fibers, they connect the lateral geniculate body to the area 17, that is the primary visual area present in the occipital cortex, and this forms optic radiations. That is, this bundle of fiber is concerned with the visual pathway. Let us see the arrangement of these fibers, sensory fibers and the motor fibers. The motor and the sensory fibers in the internal capsule, they take most direct path to their destination. As such, fibers to and from the anterior part of the frontal lobe, they pass through the anterior limb of the internal capsule. The fibers to and from the posterior part of the frontal lobe and from the greater part of the parietal lobe occupy the genu and the posterior limb. The fibers to and from the temporal lobe occupy the sublentiform part. The fibers to and from the occipital lobe pass through the retrolentiform part, and some fibers from the lowest part of the parietal lobe, they accompany the temporal lobe fibers through the sublentiform part. Arterial supply. Arterial supply of the internal capsule is of utmost clinical importance. The main arteries which supply to the internal capsule, they, they are the medial and the lateral straight branches of the middle cerebral artery, the recurrent branch of the anterior cerebral artery, and anterior choroidal. So these are the three main arteries. That is the middle cerebral, the recurrent branch of the anterior cerebral artery, and the anterior choroidal artery, which give the median and lateral straight branches. There are some direct branches also arising from the internal carotid artery and from the posterior communicator. Here you can see the various parts in this diagram. You can see the various parts of the internal capsule which are supplied by these branches. And as such, you can see here the anterior limb is supplied by here the straight branches of the anterior cerebral artery, including the longest branch, that is the recurrent artery of Hebner and middle cerebral. This recurrent artery of Hebner, it is very important because this is often involved in the cerebrovascular accident. Here you can see the branches from the middle cerebral artery going to the anterior limb. The genu is supplied by straight branches of anterior cerebral, middle cerebral, and direct branch from the internal cavity. Here you can very well appreciate the branches coming from the anterior cerebral, branch coming from the middle cerebral, and from the recurrent, sorry, from the internal cavity. Yeah. The posterior limb, is supplied by striate branches from the middle cerebral artery, including a large branch known as Charcot's artery of the cerebral hemorrhage, and there is a branch coming from the anterior parietal artery. So you can see the posterior limb is supplied by branch from the middle cerebral artery, branch from the anterior parietal artery, and branch from the middle cerebral artery. One of the branches, the side branch is very large, and it is known as Charcot's artery of cerebral hemorrhage, and this is very often ruptured and involved in the cerebrovascular accident. The sublentiform part. It is supplied by a striate branch from the posterior cerebral and from the anterior parietal. Here you can see from the striate branch coming from the anterior cerebral, and here you can see the striate branch coming from the posterior cerebral. The retrolentiform branch are supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Here in this diagram, you can see how the middle cerebral artery is giving branches, striate branches going to the corpus striatum, that is a lentiform capsule here, lentiform nucleus. So this is the internal carotid artery giving a anterior cerebral branch and becoming continuous as middle cerebral artery. The anterior cerebral artery runs forwards in the anterior in the median sulcus, median cerebral sulcus, while the middle cerebral artery comes to lie in the lateral sulcus and gives, you can see the branches to the internal capsule, go, go to the anterior limb, genu, and the posterior limb, and the cortical branches, they are going here to the cerebral cortex. Here in this diagram, you can very well see again the branches of the middle cerebral artery, the anterior cerebral artery going anteriorly, middle is lying in the lateral sulcus, the to summarize, the upper parts of the anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb are supplied by medial and lateral branches of middle cerebral artery. One of the lateral striate branches is larger and more frequent in rupture. It is often known as Charcot's artery of cerebral hemorrhage. It enters through the anterior perforated substance and supplies the posterior limb. The lower parts of these internal capsule are supplied by the lower part of the anterior limb is supplied by medial straight branch of the anterior cerebral artery, also called recurrent artery of hemorrhage. The lower part of the genu is supplied by direct branches from the internal carotid and from the posterior communicating artery. The lower part of the posterior limb is supplied by anterior parietal artery, and a straight branch of posterior cerebral artery. In this diagram, you can very well appreciate how the upper and the lower parts of the internal capsule they are supplied. The upper part of the anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb they are supplied by the middle cerebral artery, anterior limb, genu by the internal carotid artery, and posterior limb again by the middle cerebral artery. So, and anterior limb, the middle cerebral artery, genu, the internal carotid artery, and the posterior limb again by the middle cerebral artery. The lower part here, you can see lower part of the internal capsule is supplied by the habenar artery and from the posterior cerebral artery. You can see the retrodentiform part. This is supplied by the internal carotid artery. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the blood supply is very important. Blood supply of the internal capsule is very important because of its clinical significance. A lesion in the internal capsule is most likely to occur from the thrombosis or rupture of one of the arteries supplying the internal capsule. The artery most commonly involved is the Charcot's artery of cerebral hemorrhage. Here, in this diagram, you can see how the blood vessels they are involved in the thrombosis or hemorrhage. Here you can see a clot block the flow and there is a gradual ischemia of the internal capsule and the cerebral cortex. Here you can see the bleeding may occur in any of the branches, especially the Charcot's artery. And so the blood supply of the internal capsule and the cerebral cortex may suffer. So to summarize, the thrombosis in an artery supplying the internal capsule, that is the cerebral thrombosis, leads to the stroke that results in contralateral hemiplegia. Contralateral refers to the opposite. Hemiplegia meaning is the paralysis of the half of the body. So if there is lesion on the one's right side, the paralysis is on the left side and vice versa. That is, if the lesion is on the right side, then the paralysis is on the left side. As the tracts are closely packed, even a small lesion can cause extensive upper motor neuron type of paralysis. So as the fibers they are compactly packed in the internal capsule, even a small lesion in these vessels supplying the internal capsule cause a neurological lesion in large part of the body. Now, the upper motor neuron means the fibers which are coming from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord or to the cranial nuclei, they are interrupted because the motor pathways they are of two order neurons, upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. So if the upper motor neuron and they become damaged, then the paralysis is of upper motor neuron type. If there is a damage in the spinal cord, then the paralysis is of lower motor neuron type. Not only the motor fibers are involved, sensations are also lost in the area supplied, and the reflexes are exaggerated. So the various jerks, various spinal cord reflexes, they are exaggerated because the, control of the higher centers is lost. So spinal cord acts on its own, and because of that, there is overshooting of the reflexes. So that is all about the internal capsule, the fibers present, motor and sensory fibers present in the internal capsule, the blood supply, and the various lesions which may occur because of the lesions in the cerebral vessels, either because of the cerebral thrombosis or because of the cerebral hemorrhage. And the condition is as such known as cerebrovascular accident or the stroke.